February 19, 1945. 6,000 feet above the volcanic shores of Iwo Jima, Lieutenant Thomas "Cyclone" Blackburn gripped the control stick of his F-4U Corsair as sweat dripped into his eyes. His breathing quickened as he spotted them, 21 Japanese Zeros, forming up behind his 8-plane squadron. The radio crackled with panicked voices as his wingmen spotted the threat. Orders from the USS Essex came through clearly. Return to carrier. Disengage immediately. Blackburn's hand hovered over the throttle, muscles tense with indecision. The Japanese fighters were closing fast, their rising sun emblems growing larger by the second. His squadron was outmatched, outgunned, and flying dangerously low on fuel after providing close air support for Marines struggling on the beaches below. "Command, this is Blackburn," he responded, voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Requesting permission to execute counter-maneuver." "Negative, Lieutenant. Return to carrier. That's a direct order." The acrid smell of engine oil filled his cockpit as Blackburn watched the Japanese formation tightening behind his vulnerable squadron. Standard naval aviation doctrine was clear. When outnumbered more than 2 to 1, American pilots were to disengage and return to their carrier. But Blackburn knew something the commanders didn't. Something he'd been practicing in secret during dawn patrol flights when no one was watching. He took a deep breath and made his decision. "Breaking formation," he announced, banking his Corsair hard to the right as his squadron mates called out in confusion, "Follow my lead exactly. Trust me." No one in the 31st Fighter Squadron knew that one pilot's defiance that morning would rewrite naval aviation tactics forever, saving not only their lives, but hundreds more in the brutal Pacific Air War to come. Thomas Blackburn was born on September 3, 1922, in the small farming community of Millfield, Ohio. The son of a First World War veteran turned mechanic, young Thomas grew up with his hands perpetually coated in engine grease and his eyes fixed on the sky. His father, William Blackburn, had served as a mechanic for the early American air squadrons in France, returning home with stories of brave pilots and their flying machines that captured his son's imagination. "My dad would tell me those pilots had something special," Blackburn would later recall in his memoir. "Not just courage, but a kind of creative instinct. They made up tactics as they went, because nobody had written the rules for air combat yet." The Great Depression hit the Blackburn family hard. By age 12, Thomas was working alongside his father in their small garage, burning to repair everything from tractors to the rare automobile that passed through their rural community. His mother, Eleanor, a schoolteacher, insisted he continue his education despite financial hardships. It was his mathematics teacher who first noticed Thomas had an unusual spatial intelligence, able to visualize complex three-dimensional problems and solve them intuitively. He could see things in motion before they moved, his high school principal would later tell the Columbus Dispatch. It was as if physics was a language he was born speaking. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Blackburn was studying mechanical engineering at Ohio State University on a partial scholarship, working nights at a machine shop to cover the remainder of his expenses. He enlisted the very next morning, determined to become a pilot despite never having set foot in an aircraft. His aptitude tests revealed exceptional mechanical comprehension and spatial reasoning, enough to fast-track him through preliminary training despite his lack of prior flight experience. But when he arrived at Naval Air Station Pensacola in March 1942, Blackburn found himself surrounded by pilots who had logged hundreds of civilian flight hours before the war. Some looked down on the factory boy from Ohio who had never touched an aircraft control before enlistment. "First time I climbed into a Stearman trainer, I froze," Blackburn admitted in a rare post-war interview for Naval Aviation Quarterly. "Not from fear, but from pure awe. I'd spent my life studying how things worked, and suddenly I was inside the most complicated machine I'd ever seen, expected to make it dance." What Blackburn lacked in experience, he made up for in mechanical intuition. While other cadets memorized checklists and procedures, He studied the aircraft systems until he understood not just what to do, but why each action mattered. This approach impressed some instructors, but infuriated others, particularly when he began questioning established flight tactics and procedures. Lieutenant Commander Harold Baines, his primary flight instructor, documented the first major incident in Blackburn's training record. Cadet deliberately executed unauthorized inverted maneuvers during basic flight training. When questioned, responded that he was testing a theory about airflow over the wings. Attitude borders on insubordination. This incident, followed by a similar confrontation 2 months later when he challenged combat maneuvering techniques being taught, nearly got him washed out twice during training. His flight logs from this period, preserved in naval archives, show repeated notations of excessive questioning of instruction and tendency toward unauthorized experimentation. Lieutenant Blackburn shows exceptional skill but dangerous independence, read one evaluation. Tendency to improvise when standard procedures would suffice. Recommend additional discipline before combat assignment. That evaluation almost ended his flying career before it began. But a senior instructor, Commander James Thatch, himself the inventor of the famous Thack-Weave defensive flying tactic, recognized something in the young pilot that others missed. Some pilots follow the manual perfectly and die perfectly, Thatch noted in his override recommendation. Others rewrite the manual in the air and bring their men home. Put Blackburn in the second category. By the summer of 1944, Blackburn had earned his wings and joined the 31st Fighter Squadron aboard the USS Essex, one of the new Essex-class carriers that formed the backbone of America's Pacific Fleet. His fellow pilots initially viewed his questioning nature with suspicion. Naval aviation was built on precision, coordination, and above all, following orders. Blackburn's habit of asking why about established tactics made him an outsider. We called him Cyclone because he was always stirring things up, recalled his wingman, Lieutenant Daniel Freeman, always asking why we couldn't try something different. Most of us figured he'd either wash out or get himself killed in his first engagement. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation for the entire squadron. By February 1945, the Pacific War had reached a critical juncture. American forces were advancing island by island toward Japan, each battle more desperate than the last as they closed the distance to the Japanese homeland. Iwo Jima, a tiny volcanic island just 750 miles south of Tokyo, became a focal point of the American strategy. Its airfields would provide a crucial emergency landing strip for B-29 bombers returning from raids on the Japanese mainland, and as a staging area for the planned invasion of Japan itself. The Japanese High Command understood Iwo Jima's strategic importance perfectly. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent months transforming the island into a fortress, with an elaborate network of bunkers, tunnels, and hidden artillery positions. Over 20,000 Japanese defenders were dug into the island's volcanic rock, prepared to fight to the last man under explicit orders from Tokyo. No surrender, no retreat. The American invasion force was massive, 70,000 Marines backed by the most powerful naval and air force ever assembled in the Pacific. The battle began with 72 consecutive days of bombing and naval bombardment, yet when the Marines landed on February 19, 1945, they found the Japanese defenses largely intact. Kuribayashi had ordered his men to hold their fire during the initial bombardment, preserving their strength for the ground assault. The Japanese defenders had transformed the 8-square-mile island into a fortress of interlocking fields of fire. Mount Suribachi, the extinct volcano on the southern tip, housed artillery positions that could target any part of the beaches. Underground tunnels spanning 27 miles connected defensive positions, allowing Japanese forces to appear seemingly out of nowhere to counter American advances. For the Japanese High Command, Iwo Jima represented more than just a strategic position. It was Japanese soil, the first American invasion of territory, considered part of the Japanese homeland. The psychological impact was immense. Japanese propaganda emphasized that the Americans were now directly threatening Japan itself, helping to mobilize the remaining military resources for a desperate defense. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor and now served as an air staff officer, later wrote in his memoirs, "When Iwo Jima came under direct attack, we knew the homeland would be next. Every aircraft, every pilot we could commit became essential, even if the odds of success were minimal." As the Marines struggled to establish a beachhead on the black volcanic sand, naval aviation units, including Blackburn's 31st Fighter Squadron, provided critical close air support. Flying their distinctive F-4U Corsairs with their inverted gull wings, they strafed Japanese positions and dropped bombs on bunkers to support the advancing Marines. The steep dive capabilities of the Corsair made it particularly effective at precision bombing runs against the concrete fortifications that dotted the island. What the American command didn't anticipate was the Japanese air response. Having husbanded their remaining air strength, the Japanese launched a desperate counterattack from bases on the home islands. 21 fighters, a mix of A6M0s and the newer Ki-84 Frank fighters, had been dispatched to disrupt the American air support and target the vulnerable transport ships delivering men and supplies to the beachhead. The timing couldn't have been worse for Blackburn's squadron. After 3 hours of close air support missions, the 8 Corsairs were running dangerously low on fuel and ammunition. Standard doctrine called for them to return to their carrier, refuel, rearm, and allow a fresh squadron to take their place. But as they formed up to return to the Essex, the Japanese attack force appeared. For the American Naval High Command, the tactical situation seemed straightforward. The Corsair pilots were to disengage and return to their carrier. The combat air patrol from other carriers would intercept the Japanese attack force. But there was a critical problem with this plan. The closest combat air patrol was 15 minutes away, leaving the Marine beachhead and the transport ships vulnerable for a crucial window of time. If we had followed orders and returned to the Essex, Blackburn later explained, those Japanese fighters would have had 15 minutes of unopposed attacks on our boys on the beach and the ships supplying them. The casualty count would have been in the thousands. The battle for Iwo Jima would eventually claim nearly 7,000 American lives and virtually the entire Japanese garrison of 21,000 men. It would be one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history, and it could have been even worse if not for what happened 6,000 feet above the island on that February morning. As Lieutenant Blackburn broke formation against direct orders, confusion rippled through both the American and Japanese forces. His 7 squadron mates hesitated momentarily, torn between following their leader and obeying the commands from the Essex. The Japanese pilots, seeing the lead American fighter breaking away, adjusted their attack vector, assuming the Americans were attempting to scatter and escape. "I remember thinking he'd lost his mind," Lieutenant Freeman recalled. "Breaking formation when we were outnumbered 3-1 went against everything we'd been taught. But there was something in his voice over the radio, a certainty that made us follow." Blackburn's Corsair banked hard right, dropping 2,000 feet in a controlled dive that pushed him to the edge of a blackout. The G-forces crushed him into his seat as the horizon tilted wildly in his canopy, but instead of continuing the dive, the standard evasive maneuver, Blackburn suddenly reversed his controls, pulling back hard on the stick while simultaneously rolling his aircraft and chopping his throttle momentarily. The Corsair shuddered violently as it appeared to stall, hanging momentarily in the air as if suspended by invisible wires. To the Japanese pilots pursuing him, it appeared the American aircraft had suffered a catastrophic control failure. Physics suggested the Corsair should continue its momentum in a predictable arc, but Blackburn had discovered that the gull-winged fighter had a unique aerodynamic property when pushed to its limits. The F-4U Corsair's distinctive inverted gull wing, designed originally to accommodate its massive 13-foot propeller while maintaining shorter landing gear, created an unexpected aerodynamic effect when the aircraft was subjected to specific control inputs at the edge of its performance envelope. Blackburn had discovered that at precisely 187 knots, with 23% throttle reduction, full rudder deflection, and a simultaneous roll input, the Corsair's airflow patterns would momentarily detach and then reattach in a way that defied conventional aerodynamics. "It's all about disrupting the expected airflow," he would explain in a classified technical briefing weeks later. "For a fraction of a second, you're creating a controlled aerodynamic anomaly, essentially making the aircraft pivot around its own axis in a way that no design engineer ever intended or predicted." In engineering terms, the maneuver exploited a phenomenon later known as asymmetric vortex breakdown, something that wouldn't be fully understood by aeronautical engineers until decades later. But in that moment, thousands of feet above Iwo Jima, all that mattered was that it worked. "It wasn't in any manual," he explained years later. "I found it by accident during a dawn patrol when I pushed too hard in a practice dogfight. The Corsair could perform what looked like an impossible turn if you timed the throttle, rudder, and stick just right. The plane seemed to pivot on its wingtip, changing direction almost 90 degrees instantaneously. The Japanese pilots, expecting the American formation to continue its dive, had committed to their attack run. Now, suddenly, Blackburn's Corsair was behind them, having executed what appeared to be an impossible turn. Even more astonishing, his 7 squadron mates had followed his lead, mimicking the maneuver with varying degrees of success. In an instant, the tactical situation had reversed. The hunters became the hunted. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," radioed Lieutenant Michael Harrison, another pilot in the squadron. "The Japs flew right past us like we'd vanished and reappeared behind them." The Japanese formation, disciplined and experienced, attempted to recover and re-engage, but they had committed to their diving attack, trading altitude for speed, the lifeblood of aerial combat. Now they found themselves in a vulnerable position, having to climb and turn to meet the threat that had materialized behind them. The lead Japanese pilot, later identified from intelligence reports as Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, a veteran with more than 30 combat sorties, attempted to rally his forces. He executed a tight climbing turn that would have impressed even the most skilled American pilots. But the tactical advantage had already shifted irrevocably. Through his windscreen, Blackburn could see the strain on the Japanese aircraft as they fought against physics and surprise. The distinctive red circles on their wings flashed in the Pacific sun as they maneuvered desperately to regain formation integrity. He could almost sense their confusion through the aluminum and canvas that separated opponents in aerial combat, the momentary disorientation when the expected becomes impossible. Blackburn keyed his radio. "Target the trailing aircraft first, short bursts. Conserve ammunition." His voice remained calm, methodical, as if he were conducting a training exercise rather than fighting for his life. The Corsairs, despite their low fuel and ammunition, now held the tactical advantage. Their initial volley brought down 3 Japanese fighters, trailing smoke as they spiraled toward the gray Pacific below. The remaining Japanese pilots attempted to regroup, but Blackburn's squadron maintained the initiative. Using their altitude advantage, they executed a series of coordinated attacks, breaking the Japanese formation into smaller, more vulnerable groups. 5 more enemy aircraft fell in quick succession. Lieutenant Gregory Mendez, the squadron's most junior pilot, on his first combat mission, found himself momentarily isolated as 2 Japanese Zeros maneuvered to attack him from both sides, a classic scissors maneuver that had claimed many Allied pilots. "I'm bracketed," he called over the radio, voice rising with panic. "Negative throttle, full left rudder, then full throttle and right stick," Blackburn commanded. "Now!" Mendez, running on instinct and trust, followed the instructions precisely. His Corsair performed the same mysterious stall turn that had initially reversed the battle, causing one of the Japanese fighters to overshoot while bringing him into firing position against the second. His guns blazed, and another Zero fell. "How did you know that would work?" Mendez would ask Blackburn later. "Mathematics," was the simple reply. The Corsair stalls at a different angle depending on throttle position. If you time it right, you can make the plane do things that look impossible. In less than 4 minutes, 13 Japanese aircraft had been shot down. The remaining 8, their formation shattered and their attack plan in ruins, turned back toward the Japanese mainland. The entire engagement had consumed less than 5 minutes and cost the Japanese Air Force 21 irreplaceable veteran pilots, 13 dead and 8 retreating. Most remarkably, not a single American aircraft was lost. Blackburn's unorthodox maneuver, soon to be known throughout the Pacific Fleet as the ghost turn for the way it made American fighters seem to vanish and reappear, had completely reversed what should have been a disastrous engagement. The 8 Corsairs, their fuel gauges now flashing red warnings, turned back toward the USS Essex. Lieutenant Commander William Masterson, the Air Group commander, was waiting on the flight deck as they landed, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. "You disobeyed a direct order, Lieutenant," were his first words to Blackburn as he climbed from his cockpit, legs shaking from adrenaline and exertion. "Yes, sir," Blackburn replied simply. "I did." "That's a court-martial offense in the middle of a war zone." "Yes, sir." Masterson stared at the young pilot for a long moment, then glanced at the other 7 pilots who had landed behind their leader. Each man stood by his aircraft, watching the confrontation with tense expressions. 13 confirmed kills, no losses," Masterson finally said. "I've never seen anything like it. What do you call that maneuver you used?" "I don't have a name for it, sir." "It's just physics," Masterson nodded slowly. "Well, you're still in serious trouble, Lieutenant. Report to the Admiral's briefing room in 1 hour, and bring your logbook. I want a complete explanation of this physics." As Blackburn walked away, Lieutenant Freeman fell into step beside him. "So, are we heroes or are we screwed?" "Probably both," Blackburn replied with a tired smile. "But we're alive, and so are a lot of Marines who would have been strafed if those Zeros had gotten through." He had no idea that his next meeting would transform naval aviation tactics for the remainder of the war. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58, was not a man known for his patience with rule breakers. A pioneer of naval aviation himself, he had helped write many of the tactical doctrines that Blackburn had so flagrantly ignored. Yet as he reviewed the after-action reports and gun camera footage from the engagement, his expression changed from stern disapproval to intense curiosity. "You're telling me you discovered this maneuver by accident?" he asked, as Blackburn stood at attention before his desk. "Yes, sir. During dawn patrol exercises 3 weeks ago. I pushed the aircraft too hard in a turn, and instead of stalling conventionally, it shifted. I've been practicing it since then, trying to understand the exact conditions that make it possible." "And you taught this to your squadron without authorization?" Blackburn hesitated. "Not officially, sir. I suggested they watch me during morning patrols. Some of them picked it up, others thought I was just showing off." Admiral Mitcher leaned back in his chair, studying the young pilot. "Lieutenant, do you understand the purpose of standard combat doctrines?" "To ensure predictable outcomes and coordinated actions under stress, sir." "Exactly. When a pilot goes rogue, it endangers the entire unit." Mitcher paused, tapping a pencil against the action report on his desk. "However, naval aviation doctrine has evolved precisely because pilots like you occasionally discover something new. Thatch developed his weave by experimenting outside-approved tactics. For the first time, Blackburn allowed himself to hope he might not be facing a court-martial after all. "I want you to work with the Air Group commanders to document this maneuver precisely," Mitcher continued. "Every detail, airspeed, altitude, throttle position, control inputs. Then I want you to develop a training protocol to teach it safely." "Yes, sir." "Officially, Lieutenant, you're being reprimanded for disobeying a direct order in combat. That will go in your record." The Admiral's stern expression softened slightly. "Unofficially, you may have just saved hundreds of lives today, and potentially thousands more if this maneuver can be properly integrated into our combat doctrine." Admiral Mitcher stood and walked to the window of his briefing room, looking out at the carrier flight deck where mechanics were servicing the Corsairs that had just returned. "War is a brutal equation, Lieutenant. Sometimes the mathematics of victory are written in unconventional actions. Your turn defied conventional aerodynamics, just as your decision defied conventional orders. Both work today. Make sure you can replicate the former before I decide whether to forgive the latter. Blackburn swallowed hard. Understood, sir. As he turned to leave, Mitcher added, And Lieutenant, that name your squadron is using, Ghost Turn. I like it. Make sure that goes in the training manual. Over the next 3 weeks, as the battle for Iwo Jima raged below, Blackburn worked with the Air Group's most experienced pilots to document and standardize the Ghost Turn. The maneuver was technically complex, pushing the F-4U Corsair to the edge of its performance envelope. Not every pilot could execute it successfully on the first try, or the 10th. But those who mastered it gained an almost supernatural advantage in combat. Lieutenant Freeman, who had followed Blackburn into that first engagement, became one of the most skilled practitioners. It's like the plane disappears from the enemy's world for a split second, he explained to a group of newly arrived replacement pilots. You're where physics says you can't possibly be, and that second of confusion is all you need. The Ghost Turn quickly spread beyond the 31st Fighter Squadron to other Corsair units throughout the Pacific Fleet. Within months, it had become a standard part of the advanced fighter tactics curriculum for Navy and Marine Corps pilots preparing to deploy. Commander Ellis Bud Stanton, who led Fighter Squadron VF-17, the famous Jolly Rogers, implemented the technique with his entire unit after witnessing a demonstration by Blackburn in April 1945. It was like watching someone rewrite physics, Stanton noted in his after-action report. 1 minute the Corsair was committed to a predictable flight path. The next, it was somewhere entirely different. In combat, that's the difference between life and death. During the Okinawa campaign, just weeks after the Ghost Turn's introduction, pilots from Marine Fighter Squadron VMF-221 employed the maneuver with devastating effect against Japanese kamikazes, attempting to hit American ships offshore. Lieutenant Colonel James Sweat, already an ace with 15 confirmed kills, added 4 more in a single engagement using the Ghost Turn to counter Japanese suicide tactics. The Japanese pilots were committed to their attack runs, Sweat reported. When our Corsairs seemed to vanish and reappear, they had no contingency. Their training hadn't prepared them for what they were seeing. The Japanese, encountering the maneuver with increasing frequency, initially believed they were facing a new model of the Corsair with enhanced capabilities. Intelligence reports recovered after the war revealed that Japanese pilots had begun referring to the ghost fighters that seemed to defy normal flight characteristics. A captured Japanese intelligence assessment from June 1945 noted, American Corsairs now demonstrate impossible turning capabilities. Pilots report aircraft that seem to disappear momentarily before reappearing in attack position, suspect new variant with enhanced control surfaces, or possible prototype jet assist technology. By the time they realized it was a tactical innovation rather than a technological one, the war was entering its final phase. Naval intelligence estimated that between March and August 1945, the Ghost Turn contributed to the destruction of 73 additional Japanese aircraft, while saving at least 37 American fighters that would otherwise have been lost. Each American pilot saved represented not just a life preserved, but the retention of hundreds of hours of irreplaceable training and combat experience. The human impact extended far beyond the numbers. Marine Sergeant James Kelly, part of the 3rd Marine Division fighting on Iwo Jima, later credited Blackburn's squadron with saving his company when they prevented Japanese air attacks on that crucial day. We were pinned down on Red Beach with minimal cover, Kelly wrote in a letter that reached Blackburn after the war. If those Japanese planes had gotten through to strafe our position, my entire unit would have been wiped out. Because your squadron stopped them, 217 Marines came home who otherwise wouldn't have. My son was born 3 months after I returned. I named him Thomas. As for Lieutenant Thomas, Cyclone Blackburn himself, his act of calculated disobedience brought both recognition and a complex legacy. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions above Iwo Jima, But the official citation carefully avoided mentioning his disobedience of orders, focusing instead on his exceptional airmanship and innovative tactical execution. After the war, Blackburn returned to Ohio, completing his engineering degree at Ohio State University under the GI Bill. He married his college sweetheart, Catherine Reynolds, in 1947, and they raised 3 children in Columbus, where Blackburn worked as an aerospace engineer for North American Aviation, later contributing to designs that would influence generations of fighter aircraft. The transition back to civilian life wasn't entirely smooth. Like many combat veterans, Blackburn struggled with the psychological aftermath of war. His wife, Catherine, would later recall nights when he would wake suddenly, drenched in sweat, his hands gripping invisible controls as he relived those moments above Iwo Jima. The responsibility weighed on him, she explained to a historian documenting the ghost turn in 1984. He never regretted his decision, but he felt the weight of having asked 7 other men to follow him into something untested, something that could have gotten them all killed if he'd been wrong. Blackburn channeled these experiences into his professional work. At North American Aviation, he became known for his unique approach to aircraft testing and design, always considering how pilots would interact with aircraft systems under extreme stress. His insights directly influenced several key safety features in the F-86 Sabrejet and later aircraft designs. An aircraft isn't just an engineering problem, he wrote in a 1956 internal memo uncovered by aviation historians. It's a psychological problem, too. We need to design for the moment when everything is falling apart, when the pilot is experiencing maximum stress and minimum cognitive capacity. That's when design matters most. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Blackburn quietly consulted with the Navy on fighter tactics and pilot training, though he rarely spoke publicly about his wartime experiences. His technical papers on aircraft control systems at high-stress thresholds became required reading at test pilot schools. He never talked much about the war, his oldest son William recalled. When I asked about his medals, he'd just say he was in the right place at the right time with the right idea. It wasn't until I was in college and took a course on aviation history that I realized my quiet dad had changed the way aerial combat worked. Blackburn did occasionally correspond with his former squadron mates, particularly Daniel Freeman, who remained in the Navy and rose to the rank of commander before retiring in 1965. Their letters, preserved in the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, reveal the deep bond forged in those desperate moments above Iwo Jima. "Still can't believe you had us do barrel rolls with zeros on our tails," Freeman wrote in 1952. "Craziest thing I ever did in my life. Also, the smartest." Blackburn's reply was characteristic of his humble nature. Wasn't barrel rolls, just physics nobody had noticed yet. Right place, right time. In 1972, nearly 3 decades after the battle, Blackburn was invited to speak at the Naval Air Training Command in Corpus Christi, Texas. His lecture on the development of the ghost turn was recorded and became required viewing for naval aviation cadets for years afterward. In it, he addressed the central tension of his most famous action. "Military discipline exists for a reason," he told the room full of young pilots. 99% of the time, following your training and your orders is exactly the right thing to do. But that other 1%, when what you're seeing with your own eyes contradicts what you've been told to do, that's when you have to make the hardest choice of all." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "I'm not standing here telling you to disobey orders. I'm telling you to understand why your orders exist in the first place. Know the principles behind your training so deeply that on that rare occasion when circumstances change faster than commands can, you can act in the spirit of those principles rather than the letter of those commands." The mathematics of victory that day above Iwo Jima weren't just about the physics of the ghost turn, though that was remarkable enough. They were about the ethical calculus that every military leader faces. When does the responsibility to the immediate mission outweigh the responsibility to follow the chain of command? For Blackburn, The answer came down to a simple truth he expressed in that same lecture. The purpose of military discipline isn't to create robots. It's to create warriors who can think and act with the disciplined initiative that wins battles when plans fail. The Ghost turn itself eventually became obsolete as aircraft technology evolved beyond the F-4U Corsair's unique aerodynamic properties. Modern fly-by-wire systems and computer-controlled flight surfaces make today's fighter aircraft more predictable and less susceptible to the kind of aerodynamic quirk that Blackburn discovered and exploited. But the principle behind his decision, disciplined initiative in the face of rapidly changing circumstances, remains a cornerstone of modern military doctrine. The United States Naval Aviation Training Command now includes a case study on Blackburn's actions in their leadership curriculum, using it to illustrate the concept of commander's intent, the idea that understanding the purpose behind orders is as important as the orders themselves. Thomas Blackburn passed away on June 12, 2003, at the age of 81. His obituary in the Columbus Dispatch mentioned his distinguished flying cross and his contribution to naval aviation tactics, but focused primarily on his family, his 49-year career as an engineer, and his volunteer work teaching mathematics to disadvantaged youth. At his funeral, attended by 3 generations of naval aviators, Commander Daniel Freeman, then 80 years old, delivered a eulogy that captured the essence of his friend's legacy. "Tom never wanted to be called a hero," Freeman said, his voice thick with emotion. "He always said he was just a guy who noticed something others had missed. But that's exactly what makes someone a hero, seeing what others don't, acting when others won't, and having the courage to bear the consequences either way." Freeman gestured to the naval aviation insignia on Blackburn's casket. "There are hundreds of men who came home because of what Tom did in those few minutes above Iwo Jima. There are thousands of children and grandchildren who exist because their fathers and grandfathers survived that day. And there are countless naval aviators who lived because they learned the ghost turn, or because they learned the more important lesson behind it, that sometimes the boldest choice is the safest one." As we reflect on the story of Thomas Cyclone Blackburn and his ghost turn, we're confronted with a timeless question about courage, innovation, and the nature of true discipline. In that moment, 6,000 feet above Iwo Jima, when Blackburn had to choose between following his orders and following his instincts, he chose the path that seemed to break the rules, but ultimately fulfilled the higher purpose those rules were designed to serve. Veterans of the Pacific Air War would later recount that Blackburn's innovation came at a crucial juncture in the conflict. Japanese pilots, facing increasingly desperate circumstances, had begun adopting more aggressive and unpredictable tactics. American naval aviation needed an edge, something to counter the combination of exceptional Japanese pilot skill and their increasingly fatalistic approach to combat. "The ghost turn gave us that psychological advantage," explained Rear Admiral Charles Henderson in a 1978 interview. "When you're facing an opponent who isn't afraid to die, you need something that changes the equation completely." Blackburn's maneuver did that. It introduced an element of the impossible into the calculus of combat. How do you fight against something that shouldn't exist? The 21 Japanese fighters that vanished that day, 13 shot down and 8 forced to retreat, represent more than just an impressive victory tally. They represent the difference between following procedures and understanding principles, between obeying commands and fulfilling mission. Every one of us faces similar moments of decision in our lives, though rarely with such immediate or dramatic consequences. We find ourselves caught between what we are told to do and what we know is right, between the safe path of compliance and the risky path of innovation. Would you have broken the order or obeyed it? Would you have trusted your own judgment enough to risk everything on a maneuver you discovered but couldn't fully explain? Would you have had the courage to bear the consequences if you were wrong? Thomas Blackburn's ghost turn reminds us that sometimes the most powerful acts of heroism aren't dramatic charges into enemy fire, but quiet moments of calculated defiance when someone sees a better way forward and has the courage to take it. His story deserves to be remembered not just as a fascinating tactical innovation, but as a testament to the power of disciplined initiative, the kind of thinking that transforms underdogs into heroes and rewrites the rules of what's possible. Share this story so others remember what courage really means, not blind defiance, but the wisdom to know when following the spirit of the mission requires breaking from the letter of command. In a world that often rewards compliance over creativity, we need more ghost turns. Those unexpected pivots that change everything when the stakes are highest.